Okay, I guess we're close enough to 4 o'clock. We can get started. So my name is Rob Windsor, and this session is JavaScript and jQuery for SharePoint developers. Basically, if you look at sort of the web development world in general over the last several years, there's been a very noticeable shift from doing predominantly server-side code to either a combination of server-side and client-side code, or a complete shift away from server-side code to using client-side code. The whole idea of the single-page application, where basically the server serves up a page initially, and then that page never goes back to the server other than to make web service calls throughout the span of the session, has become a popular architectural choice. Now, in the SharePoint world, up until SharePoint 2013, I mean, we had the option to use JavaScript and build client-side code, but people who were doing that were generally just doing it, you know, to build some sort of fancy UI element that was responsive, but basically the remainder of the stuff was all still server code. And then when SharePoint 2013 was first announced, or people were talking about how is SharePoint 2013 going to work, and with the introduction of the SharePoint app model, where we can't use the server object model at all, right? And we're building SharePoint-hosted apps. Our only choice is to use JavaScript client-side code. People all of a sudden went, oh, geez, well, I haven't really explored that stuff. I don't really, I still have focused mostly on server-side code. So it's kind of, we need to, in the SharePoint developer world, really sort of play catch-up to what the web development world has been doing for quite some time. Now, there's some benefits to the fact that, other people sort of blaze the trail, right, where they've done a lot of the work when there was really bad tooling in Visual Studio, and where there weren't a whole bunch of JavaScript libraries out there that we could use and so on. Now we're coming in sort of more on the tail end, where all this stuff is all there sort of available for us. So what this session is I'm going to assume that you understand the basics of programming with JavaScript. So like the syntax of the if statements and loops and all that kind of stuff. The basics of jQuery. I'm going to take you from that point to how do we use JavaScript and jQuery within the context of SharePoint, and what are some I hate to use the word best practices, so I'll use suggested practices we can use to write JavaScript code in a way that is sort of enterprise ready. It's maintainable. It uses a lot of the architectural practices that we use when we're using server-side code, like layering our application logically, where we have a UI layer and a business layer or a service layer. Encapsulating our code so it's out of the global scope. A whole bunch of these kinds of practices, and really, the end result I'm trying to get to is writing JavaScript code in a way that mirrors what we do on the server side, so that we can use the practices and the architectures that we're used to using over here in VB or C#, or when we're doing stuff over here in JavaScript. And a lot of the example code and samples you're going to see don't use those same practices, so it's a little bit difficult when you first get started. But anyway, that's sort of the motivation behind this talk. So again, my name is Rob Windsor. Here's my email address and my Twitter handle. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I did tweet out a link where you can download this slide deck and all of the demo. The way I've got my SkyDrive set up, or my OneDrive set up, if I go back over here, so if you click on that link that I tweeted out, you'll get to here. But all of my talks that I give, you can just click on the 2013 link, and here's all of my talks. And there's a JavaScript and jQuery workshop. Where is that? JavaScript and jQuery workshop. In here, there's some slide decks that cover really JavaScript and jQuery for people who are brand new. So if some of the stuff I talk about today is a little bit, okay, I don't have the foundation, I don't really understand where you're going with that, you can go look at these decks, and they cover everything sort of from the very, very ground up. But I will touch on many of the things that are discussed in these slide decks as well. So my contact info is here on the first slide. I'll put it up again on the last slide, so you have it, be able to copy it down. Let's get into the actual meat of the session. And by the way, if you have any questions during the session, just yell them out or put up your hand. So if we're going to work with client-side code, the first thing we need to figure out is where am I going to put client-side libraries? Now, when we say libraries, quite often really what we mean is just a JS file, a JavaScript file. Sometimes libraries mean it's multiple JavaScript files, and those could be files that you've downloaded from the internet, like for example, if you're using jQuery or using Knockout or using Angular, or they could be JavaScript files that you've written, which has your custom business logic or your UI code and all that kind of stuff, right? So when I say JavaScript libraries, really, basically what I mean is the JS files that contain the JavaScript code, right? So where are we going to put those within SharePoint? And then once they're in SharePoint, how are we going to reference them in our pages, okay? And the one option you have is to not put stuff in SharePoint at all, right? You can use what are called content delivery networks, where organizations like jQuery, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, other organizations as well, have servers all across the world with commonly used JavaScript libraries on them, and then you just reference that server sitting out on the internet, right? And the big benefit there is that if my website uses a particular version of jQuery sitting on the jQuery content delivery network, but my users commonly visit 5 or 6 other sites that use that version of jQuery on that network. As soon as one of those sites goes and references that version of jQuery, it gets downloaded and cached in their browser cache. So now when I hit any of the other 6 sites, they get the cached version, right? So they don't have to go actually out to the internet and download the file again. So if you have reliable access to the internet for commonly used JavaScript libraries, using the content delivery network is a perfectly viable option. Okay? But if you choose to instead download the libraries and then push them out into SharePoint, there's a couple of different options we have here, and I'll talk about those in the context of this demo. So, most of the session is going to be based on a series of demos. The slides are really just there for reference back to what I've talked about in these demos. Okay? So I have 2 instances of Visual Studio here. I'm going to show you stuff in Visual Studio 2013, targeting SharePoint 2013. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about applies in older versions of Visual Studio, and also if you're using SharePoint 2010. Okay, so this stuff isn't SharePoint 2013 specific for the most part. So I'll create a new project here. In this case, I'm going to create a SharePoint app. So this is SharePoint 2013 specific. And we'll just leave the SharePoint app 39 as the name of the project. And I'm going to create a SharePoint hosted app. And it's going to go into a local site, so a site in my dev VM, and click finish. Okay? And then while that's being created, I'm going to go over to this other instance of Visual Studio, and I'm going to create a new project, and this time I'm going to create a farm solution. So I'm going to create an empty SharePoint project, we'll leave the name, and I'm going to create a farm solution, and I'm going to deploy it out into the same SharePoint local site, and click finish. Okay? So here we're talking about a SharePoint hosted app, so this is the app model. But if you're not familiar with SharePoint hosted apps, basically what the SharePoint piece of it is just a sandbox solution, right? So inside of the app package, when you package up your work, is a WSP, which is a sandbox solution, right? So the techniques I talked about over here in the context of a SharePoint hosted app will work equally as well if you're just creating a sandbox solution, not an app, right? So I'm covering apps, I'm covering sandbox solutions, and I'm covering farm solutions throughout this series of demos. Okay? So in the app/sandbox solution scenario, we can't push files up into the SharePoint system folder. It's not allowed, right? So really, our only option in terms of placing JavaScript files into SharePoint is to put them into the virtual file system, which really means putting them into the content database for the site collection. Okay, so if you notice, in the app template, that's exactly what it's doing. There's a folder here called scripts, and we have this script called app.js, which is the code behind for the default page, and we have jQuery. And then inside of here, there is an element manifest, which pushes these JavaScript files into a virtual folder in the file system called scripts. Okay, so the modular element is taking those files and provisioning them into the SharePoint content database into a virtual folder. Right? So basically, every time I install or create an instance of this app, in the site, it gets created. There's going to be a folder that gets created called scripts, and those JavaScript files will be pushed into there. Okay? So if I have 10 instances of the app, I have 10 copies of those scripts there. Right? And there's a whole version upgrade mechanism within apps and solutions you can use to upgrade those files, which is way beyond the context of this talk, but that's how you would get updates to those files pushed into SharePoint. Okay? So in this case, this is within the sandbox solution / app world, how I get the JavaScript files into SharePoint. And the next thing is, okay, once they're in SharePoint, how do I reference them inside of my page? Well, looking at the example we have here, we can see we're just using the standard HTML script element. So this script element is referencing the files by their path within SharePoint. Okay? So here, we're pushing jQuery version 1.9.1 into the scripts folder. So this is referencing that script. These two are referencing parts of the client object model library, which are deployed when SharePoint gets deployed, so they're in the layouts folder. So even if you're in SharePoint Online, those files will be there, right? You didn't deploy them, Microsoft deployed them when they created the tenant. Right, and then finally here, we have a reference to the app.js, which is effectively the code behind for this page. Okay? So we have the site page, which is going to get provisioned into a folder called pages, and then we have the scripts, which are going to be provisioned into a folder called scripts, and the page is referencing those scripts using the script elements. Okay? Good? All right, now let's come over to our farm solution. Well, our farm solution doesn't give us any of that stuff by default, so we're going to have to do this manually. Now, in a farm solution, we can push files into the SharePoint system folders. We're not restricted in that way. And because of the way we're going to the way I suggest that we reference the JavaScript files, I'm going to suggest that we push the files into the layout folder. So one benefit of pushing files in a layout folder is you only have to deploy them one time per farm. Because once they're in the layouts folder or a subfolder of the layouts folder, they're now visible farm-wide. So I deploy jQuery one time, and I can use it anywhere within my entire farm. So how do we do that? Well, first off, we're going to need two things if we want this project to emulate what's happening over here in this project. The one thing we're going to need is a page, which we can use. So in this case, instead of creating a site page, which we have in the other project, I'm going to create an application page. So I'm going to say here, add new item, and then I'm going to come down here and pick the application page template, and I'm going to call this guy demo.aspx. So this will be our page we use to navigate to. And I want the user interface to be the same as the user interface over here in the app. So basically that's just this div tag, which contains a paragraph tag. So I'll copy that over to here in the main content placeholder. And now we can get to the actual scripts themselves. So as I mentioned, I think that we should put the scripts into the layouts folder. So when I created the application page, a folder called layouts got added to our project. It's a mapped folder, which maps to the layouts folder inside of the SharePoint system folders. So what I'm going to do is just create a new folder inside of here called scripts. And then I'm going to add the scripts I need for my project into this folder. Now I've already downloaded these from the internet, so I'm going to say add existing item, and I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and there is jQuery, and I have an older version I'm using for this particular demo. And later on I'm going to reference it in one called JS Render, but for now I'm just going to add in jQuery. Okay, so because this folder is mapped to the layouts folder in the SharePoint system folders, as soon as this package gets deployed, this folder will get created and these files will get added into the system files. Okay? I don't have to do anything. I don't have to create a feature. I don't have to activate a feature. It just automatically gets deployed. right? So right now, I'm taking care of getting jQuery into SharePoint. Now what I need to do is, how do I reference jQuery over here in my page? Well, I could use the exact same technique we used over in the other project where I just use a script element, right? And then I just reference the file. Because this is in the layouts folder, I would use something that looks kind of like this, where I'd say _layouts/scripts, and then the path to my file, right? That would work perfectly fine. But if I use a different construct called the script link control, I get a lot of added benefit for free, right? So, and I forgot to open this up, so let me just do this real quick. Snippets file. So just grab these 2 lines of code here for a second, save you for watching me type them out, and then paste them in over, where are we, this project here, paste them in here. Okay, so what this is, the script link control is a control that's part of the Microsoft.SharePoint assembly, and it allows us to reference JavaScript files. Okay, now it's assuming that this is the path. The name is actually the path to the file. This is relative to the layouts folder, right? So the script link control makes the assumption the files you're loading are in the layouts folder or they're in a subfolder, right? So SPJS, which is part of the client object model, lives right in the root of the layouts. That's why we don't preface it with a path. And then jQuery lives in a folder called scripts, which is underneath the root. So that's why we do that. Okay? Now here, I'm just referencing SPJS, right? But over here, if you notice, I'm referencing, or the template is referencing SPJS and SP runtime.js, right? So this guy has a dependency on this guy, right? Well, actually, inside of SPJS, it says I have a dependency on sp.runtime.js. The script element isn't smart enough to look inside of the file and find that dependency. The script link control is. So with the script link control, we don't have to load the dependent libraries. SPJS will tell SharePoint it needs those, and SharePoint will load them for us automatically. So that's one benefit you get from using the script link control. Right? Now this really only works with libraries from Microsoft because it's like their sort of framework that has this dependency piece inside of it. Another thing the script link control can do, which we're not actually going to use in this case, is allow you to create localized versions of libraries. So if I support multiple languages in my site, I can have multiple JavaScript files, one for each of the different languages, and it will automatically load the appropriate one from the appropriate folder based on the current culture. Okay, we're not using that, so we just turn that off. I have a little bit of control over when the library actually gets added to the page. So you can see there's load after UI is true here, which means put the script element, inject the script element at the bottom of the page, and then load after UI is false here because I need jQuery during the initial page rendering, so this is going to get injected at the top of the page, right? And it all really affects what's the page load time, right? Putting the scripts at the end will make the page load initially fast. Okay. Some other things that this does, which may not be obvious, if I have, say, 4 web parts that need jQuery, right? If I have 4 script elements, then there's going to be 4 places where the browser goes to try to load jQuery. But if I use the script link control, it says, oh, well, you've asked for this library here, but you've already asked for it up here. So I know you already need it. I'm only going to put 1 script element in the page. So you're not trying to load the same library multiple times within the same page. And finally, and this really applies mostly to your custom JavaScript files, is that it will append, when it makes a request to the server to get the JavaScript file, it will append in the query string a hash, a string that represents the contents of that file. Right? So the first time I request the file, it looks at the file contents, computes the hash, appends it to the query string, and makes the request to the server for that JavaScript file. And as long as the contents of that file don't change, the hash doesn't change, so we'll use the cached version out of the browser every time I request that file. But as soon as I change the contents, the computed hash will change, which means the query string changes, which means I will automatically get the most recent version and basically defeat the browser cache, which is, in this case, I want to. Okay, so it does automatic cache busting for you on it, like just out of the box. Right, so one, the dependency loading, two, the ability to have localized versions of your library, three, control over where the file gets at or the script element gets added, the cache busting, all of these things are things you just get for free if you use the script link control. But really, it's only valuable, it only gives you these things if the library that you're loading is in the layouts folder or in a subfolder on the layouts folder. Okay, so if you have stuff sitting in your style library, your site assets in a virtual folder, just use the script element because you're not going to get any benefit really out of using the script link. Okay, so this is going to take care over here, the underscore layouts or layouts here scripts. That's going to take care of getting stuff into SharePoint, and then this is going to take care of referencing the files that I need in the code that I have. And the last thing I need to do to get this project to basically be functionally equivalent to this one is to take the script that's basically the code behind for the page here, where is that guy? It's right here. And I need to get it over into this project. So let me just copy it and then come over to here and then add in a script element. Whoops, try it again. I'm going to say here that the type of the script is equal to text JavaScript. And then I'm just going to paste in the JavaScript from the other project. Okay, so at this point I should be able to run. So if you've seen a SharePoint hosted app, basically what it does is it loads up the page. Initially, it has this text initializing on the page, and then it changes that to hello, and then the name of the current user by making a call out to the server using the client object model. Okay? So that's exactly what just happened there. Right? So this is our app, which again is functionally equivalent to our sandbox solution. And then over here in our project, if I just go ahead and deploy out the WSP to SharePoint, and then what I can do is come over here to my project, just copy that name, and then go to my SharePoint site /layouts / the project name, which is the folder underneath layouts, /demo.aspx. This is where my application page lives, and I should see a page that has Hello Rob Windsor. Okay? So now, basically, I have an application page in my farm solution, which has the same functionality as the site page does in my app. All right, so I've chosen, or at least the template in the app, plus what I created in the farm solution, has chosen different ways to deploy out and reference my JavaScript libraries. But the functionality, the end functionality, is the same. So now we've got our JavaScript files available to us. We're starting to write code. And one of the things that, when we're writing code we want as developers is some IntelliSense. So we take a look over here in the app project, and I start using, writing code here. So SP is the main sort of root of the client object model. Right? If I say SP dot, you can see I'm getting IntelliSense here into the different things available inside of the client object model. Right? I'm also using jQuery. So here if I say jQuery dot or $ dot, you can see I'm getting IntelliSense, or if I just go into here, I'm getting IntelliSense as well. Okay? So the way that Visual Studio is providing me this IntelliSense is that inside of the Visual Studio project, at the root, so notice the project structure here, we have a folder at the root of the project called scripts. And inside of that folder, there's a file called _references.js. Okay? So if you're using Visual Studio 2012 or 2013, what you can do is create a folder called scripts at the root of your project, and then add a file inside of that called _references.js, and put script references into that file. And then that will tell Visual Studio that anywhere where I use JavaScript in this entire project, give me IntelliSense for these files. So I said that I define what files I'm using in one place, and I get IntelliSense everywhere within the project. Okay? Now, if we come over to our farm solution, it doesn't have that. right? So I don't have a scripts folder here in the root of my project. I don't have an underscore references.js. So basically, I'm not getting any IntelliSense, right? If I come in here and say sp dot, it says, well, here are some things you might use, but I can't even tell you if they're real or not. I think they might be, right? Same thing if we try to use jQuery. We're not really getting anything at all, so we're not really getting any IntelliSense here whatsoever. So again, the way to fix that is to create a folder called scripts at the root. Now, I have this folder called scripts here, but it's not at the root of my project, so I can't use it. Right? I got to create one at the root of the project. So I right-click on the project and say Add New Item, and call it Scripts. Oops, sorry, not Add New Item. I want to add a folder. Add Folder, and call it Scripts. And then in here, I want to add underscore references.js. It's going to say Add New Item, and it's going to be a JavaScript file, and it's going to be called underscore references. Okay, and then in here, I need to make my script references. So in this case, these look like this. And let's come back up here, and let's paste this in. Okay. Now, when you first create underscore references.js, Visual Studio won't give you IntelliSense. You need to close the project and reopen it. If it's there already and you modify it, then that will work. But when you first create it, you just got to close and reopen the project. Okay, so let's just do that. And then now if I come over to my JavaScript code here and start typing sp dot, I'm going to get actual real IntelliSense, and the same thing with jQuery. If I start using jQuery, I get real IntelliSense and so on. Okay? So if you're using Visual Studio 2012 or 2013, this is how you can get IntelliSense added into your project. Now, unfortunately, if you're using 2010, maybe you're still doing Visual Studio, or SharePoint 2010 development with Visual Studio 2010, it doesn't understand underscore references.js. Okay. And also, Visual Studio doesn't understand the script link control. So just using the script link control isn't enough to tell Visual Studio, I want IntelliSense for this library. Okay? Using a script element does. So over here, these script elements, Visual Studio can recognize those and say, oh, you're using these libraries, I'll give you IntelliSense. But unfortunately, again, the same doesn't hold if using the script link. So in previous versions of Visual Studio, what you need to do is kind of trick Visual Studio into giving you IntelliSense through sort of like a hack. Well, it's not sort of like a hack, it is a hack. But it works, so that's the important part. Looks like this, okay? So basically what you do is, and I'm not sure, oh, sorry, I didn't want to put that there. I wanted to put it outside of there in one sec. Let me just fix that. I want to put it there. Basically what you do is, this is a compiler check, right? So is this compiler the variable constant defined? If it is defined, then include this in the page when I compile. Otherwise, just ignore it, right? So it's a compiler check. So what we're doing is at design time, we're saying, oh, I'm using the script library here, this guy, and Visual Studio says, oh, okay, well, I'll give you IntelliSense for that. But when the page gets compiled, this just gets ignored, so it doesn't get added into the page at all. Right, so when we actually run our page, it doesn't make the reference to the script. Visual Studio is just using it at design. Okay, so basically, just make sure you have a compiler, directive, or constant. I can't remember what these things are actually called, but that doesn't exist, and then you'll be good. This will work. Okay, but if you're using 2012 or 2013, the underscore references is actually the preferred way to go. Okay, so now we've got IntelliSense on both our app project, which is the same as the Sandbox Solution project, and we've got it over here in our Full Trust solution as well. So now what we can do is we can start focusing on the code itself. Okay? So let's actually just walk through this code a little bit. This is using the client object model. Okay? So this part here is jQuery. jQuery supports a whole eventing system. And what this guy does is say, when the document is ready to execute, like basically when all the elements have been added to the page, the DOM has been built, and so on, then I want you to call the getUsername function. So this is a sort of equivalent to the page load, right, in web forms, right, when the page is ready to be interacted with. Okay, let's run some code. Okay. They love that stuff. Okay, so over here, this is sort of the more traditional way to write this, but it's changing more to just this, where we just say jQuery function. This is sort of the same thing, right? It's a shorter form of the same thing. So you'll quite often see this, where it's just jQuery function. And in my code, I very rarely, actually, well, I don't use the $sign, because Microsoft, I know for sure in 2010, I think it's still out in the same case in 2013, has some JavaScript code that they wrote that uses the $sign as an identifier, which means that it's incompatible with jQuery because they both use the $sign identifier. So if you're writing JavaScript code for SharePoint, I just always use the word jQuery instead of the $sign. I haven't had any issues where my code's been broken because of incompatibilities with Microsoft code, so I found that that's just the best way to go. It's pretty rare you hit those conflicts, but you can. Okay. So here's our page load. If I had, for example, over here in my page a button, right? So I came down here to the bottom, we added in a button. So basically it's just input and then type is equal to button, and then we set the ID and so on. Let's actually let's do this. Set the ID is equal to my button. Okay, and then just close that guy off. Then what I can do over here inside of my jQuery startup, right, is get a reference to that button. Whoops. And the way we do that is using what's called a jQuery selector. So there's different syntax depending on if you're selecting by the ID of the element or the class of the element and so on. In this case, I'm going to select it by the ID. Right, so we come back over to the page. I gave it the ID my button. So if I say here pound my button, then that now goes and finds that element within the DOM and gives me a variable that references that. And then what I can do is actually set up like an event handler. So I can say here button.click is this function, this anonymous function here, right? So when the user clicks the button, go run this function. Right, so I can handle events on the UI elements using jQuery. In this case, the first one is on the page, the next one, or on the document really, in the document element, right? And the second one is on the button itself. Okay, so that's just a little tiny bit about working with jQuery. The rest of this is just JavaScript, right? So I have a function here called getUsername, which is being called up here. And then in here, basically what we're doing is using the client object model to load an object that represents the current user, right? That object is created at the top here. And then this call says, go out to SharePoint and populate this object, right? Get the values for the user object and populate this guy. And then if that completes successfully, call on getUsernameSuccess, which is this guy here. And if that fails, then call on getUsernameFail, which is this guy here. Okay? So this is an asynchronous call back out to SharePoint to populate that user object. Right? So that's basically what this code is doing. Now there's a couple other things about JavaScript that may or may not be obvious to you. One thing is relating to scope. The only thing in JavaScript that creates scope is a function. Okay, so if I come in here to get username and I say var A, or var A is local to get username, right? So this creates scope, right? If I say here, if A is equal to 1, let's just set A equal to 1 here, and then I do this guy. Oops, try that. And then here I say var B is equal to 2. B is not local to this if block. blocks don't create scope in JavaScript. So B is visible at the same scope as A. It's visible throughout the entire function. Okay, so that's one thing that may not be obvious to you, right? So in JavaScript, only functions create scope, blocks do not. Conditional blocks, loops, all those kinds of things. Okay? Another thing is you can create variables without declaring them. So I can say C is equal to 3, and that creates a variable. If you create a variable without the var keyword, it's always in the global scope. So C is visible anywhere within this entire file. Okay? Now you really don't want to do that. And actually up here, you'll see this use strict, which is kind of like the strict mode in JavaScript. It's sort of like the on explicit in VB back in the day thing. It actually disallows the use of this, even though it's valid jQuery syntax. Okay, so some browsers now will allow you to check for script mode by just saying use strict up here. And one of the things it disallows is the creation of variables without the var keyword. So this would actually fail because I have use script on if my browser supports the checking of script mode, which not all browsers do. The older browsers won't. Okay, so this is just a few things that I wanted to sort of talk about here in terms of things that may not be obvious to you when you're programming with JavaScript. Okay, so I don't need any of this stuff. All right, so I talked a little bit about the global scope. Let's talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that you'll see when you start looking at, examples of JavaScript code is people just start writing code, like, without any kind of container, right? So we got these variables up here, context and user, we got these functions in here. They're not really contained by anything. They're just sort of there, right? And what that means is they're in the global scope. Now, in a browser-based application, that means they live off of what's the window object, which is one of the core objects in the document object model. Right? So here, if I say window.context, I mean that context variable was created at the top there. Okay? Now, when you have, I don't know, what do we have, 30 lines of JavaScript code, putting stuff in the global scope isn't really that big of a deal. When we start talking about creating more JavaScript code in the way that we create server-side code, right, where we have a team of people writing hundreds of lines of JavaScript code in multiple files, well, then putting stuff in the global scope becomes very problematic. I just talked about an example where jQuery uses the $sign as a symbol, and Microsoft uses the $sign as a symbol, and that can cause a conflict, right? And the way the conflicts are resolved in JavaScript is last in wins. So if I declare 4 variables, all called Rob, at some point in my project, whatever the last one I declare is, that's the one that gets used past that point in time during the execution phase. Right? Maybe a better example would be 4 functions called Rob. Right? Well, the last function declaration replaces the other 3, so that means that's the one that's going to get used. And it won't, there's nothing that's going to tell you, oh, you've declared multiple versions of this function. I can't execute. It's just going to try to do it using the last one, and most likely you're going to get, unexpected behavior. Okay. And this is probably the most important thing you take out of this talk. If you only remember one thing, this is probably the most important one to remember. Is you want to do everything you can to get your code out of the global scope and make it local to something. And I'm going to talk about what those somethings are throughout the remainder of the talk. Okay? So one way we can get stuff out of the global scope is to make it local to a function if we can. Right? Now in this case, we take a look at context and user. Well, context is only used, let's see, here, there's context. Right? It's not used in here. So I can take context and put it inside of that function. And actually, even though user is used outside, I'm going to put it inside of there for now, just in case, just as well, right? So now what I've done is I've taken context and user out of the global scope, and I've put them into the local scope here and get user. Now, user is used in this callback specifically right here. Okay? But these functions can also be local to the getUsername function. So functions can be nested in JavaScript. So what I can do is make those functions local to the get username function. And now I've taken them out of the global scope and made them local. Right? So if we take a look now, this is an anonymous function. It doesn't have a name, so that's fine. It's not creating anything in the global scope. And then we have this get username. This is being created in the global scope. And then all this now, this other code, these two things and these two things that were in the global scope are now local. So I've gone from 5 or 6 things in the global scope down to 1. Right? If I hit F5, I'm going to get the exact same behavior as I did before, but now my code is much less prone. Oh, that's the button that I added in. That's what that box is there, right? My code is a lot less prone to potential errors, right? So just using functions as a way to contain code is something that's very commonly used within JavaScript. I can even go a little bit further. So if I come back to my project here, a very commonly used container function is what's called a self-executing anonymous function. Okay? So I can say here function, so I don't give it a name. Sorry, and I start it with an open paren, close it, the paren there, and then put where the parameter list could be, right? So if I had a parameter list here, I would pass those parameters in here. And then take everything out of here and push them into the self-executing anonymous function. Okay? So because this is a function that creates scope, but because it's anonymous, it doesn't put anything into the global namespace or the global scope. Okay? So now all of this code is local to the anonymous function, so nothing goes into the global scope, but again, the code executes exactly the same as it did before, right? So we've even gone further to protect our code from naming conflicts, meaning this much more robust, much less chances we're going to have any kind of side effects or errors because of what we've done in our code. Yeah. Okay, so let's continue on. So I've talked about using anonymous functions, right, self-executing anonymous functions as a way to contain our code. Now, when I first started seeing these things popping up, it looked odd to me. I don't know. It's just the way I look at the code, and it doesn't really map to something that I'm familiar with in my software development, right? This idea of using this function as a container. So what I really want to do, and what really sort of helped me as a developer when I first started learning these practices, was say, I want to try to map what I already know over here on the server side to what I'm doing over here on the client side. And so far, just writing script code and using anonymous functions and this kind of stuff didn't do it for me. That mental map still wasn't really there. But then I started reading about these different patterns we could use in JavaScript as a way of containing our code to get stuff out of the global scope, but that mapped much more to what I'm familiar with in .NET, let's say. Right? So in .NET, what construct do we use to help us avoid naming collisions? Namespace, exactly. Now, are there namespaces in JavaScript? No. But can we simulate namespaces in JavaScript? Absolutely. We can use an object to simulate a namespace. So what I can do up here in my code is say, window, again, in a browser-based application, window is sort of the base object. So window dot, and then let's just create a namespace called SPSNYC. Okay, and I'm just going to create a literal JavaScript object. So open and close curly braces, creating a literal JavaScript object to be the container that's going to represent that namespace. Okay. Now, normally the way you're going to see this written is this. It's going to be window.spsnyc is equal to window.spsnyc or literal JavaScript object. Okay? So this says if this namespace is already defined, just use it. Right? If it isn't already defined, then create the object. Right? So we're going to use an object as a container to represent the namespace, right? So stuff inside the object If I have something inside of the object with one name, and I have something inside of the other object with another name, those are both local to the object, right? So there's not going to be a conflict. Now, what do we put in mostly put inside of namespaces? We put classes, right? Are there classes inside of JavaScript? Not really. It's object-based, it's not object-oriented. But we can, again, simulate classes, and we do it, in this case, using functions. Right? So what I can do is say here, SPSNYC dot, and let's just call this, I don't know, demo, good enough, is equal to a function like this, okay? Now, there are several patterns you can use to represent classes inside of JavaScript. I'm going to use one pattern. It's called the revealing module pattern, but there are many other patterns out there, so you might have seen code that is written that looks different than what I'm going to show you for a way to represent a class. That's because it's using a different pattern, right? So I'm just going to show you one of the many, but this one will work, and it illustrates the points that I want to illustrate for this talk, okay? So for the demo class, the function becomes the constructor, right? So when I create a new instance of the class, this function will run, right? So what I can do is come in here and take the getUsername function and put it inside of the class. So let me just take this, copy it to the clipboard or cut it to the clipboard and put it inside of there, okay? Now remember, functions create scope. So the getUsername function is local to the constructor, which basically means it's local to the class. It's private, right? Anything you declare, any variables you declare, any functions you declare inside the constructor are private to the class, okay? But having only private functions and private variables has no value, right? Create instance of the class, we can't call anything. So how do we expose those things? How do we make them public, right? So let me just, for the purposes of the demonstration, just say here we've got this variable called foo, as well as the getUsername function. Okay? So foo is private, getUsername is private. Well, down here at the end of our constructor, what we can do is we can return, again, a literal JavaScript object. Right? So again, open and close curly braces represent a literal JavaScript object. And objects in JavaScript are basically just name value pairs, right? So I could say, I could just hard code this in, right? So I could say here name is Rob, right? And I don't know, here age, and I gotta decide how much I want a Y here. Let's go with 41, right? So that would return an object with the name Rob and the age 41. Well, I mean, we don't want to return, obviously, that from here. What we want to return is the ability for our code to call getUsername, right? So I can say here, name is equal to getUsername. So that basically now I have a property coming back from this guy called name, which will execute the getUsername function. So functions in JavaScript are objects. I can create a variable which references a function, right? Think of them like delegates or like lambdas in .NET, right? I can have a variable that references that function. I can execute the function from the variable. Now, of course, having it called name doesn't really make sense, but I wanted to show you that this name, the name of the function, and the name of the member of the class that represents, or the object that references it doesn't have to be the same. But in this case, I do want them to be the same. So I'm going to say, I'm going to have a, when you create an instance of this object, the constructor will return an object that has a property called getUsername, which you can use to execute this private function, right? Basically, I've made the function public. That's all I've really done by doing this here at the end, right? So again, when I create an instance of this object, it's going to return something that has a getUsername property, which will call the getUsername function. So now down here, where I have my jQuery startup function, right, and I don't need the anonymous function anymore, what I can do is create an instance of that object. So I can say here var demo is equal to new spsnyc.demo. And then I can say here demo dot get username, like that, right? So create an instance of the type, and then call the get username method that I've exposed by returning that from, basically revealing that. I said this is a revealing module pattern, right? I'm revealing this private implementation out to the public, is what that is. Okay? So if I have 5 here, I should get exactly the same result on my page, but now I'm starting to write code in a way that mimics or mirrors what I'm doing over on the server side, right? I'm starting to think about encapsulating different or common classes in the namespaces, right? So and then what I can also start to think of is, well, okay, so I do that, that's cool, right? I've now encapsulated stuff. This foo guy is not exposed outside, so I'm using encapsulation. I'm starting to use object-oriented principles. But what are some of the other principles that we use on the server side? Right? Well, if you talk about architectural practices or software development practices, one of the things we talk about is single responsibility, right? We want classes to perform, or methods to perform have one responsibility, not multiple. Well, if we take a look at this code, it actually has multiple responsibilities, right? It's getting the username and it's updating the UI. Right? Well, what I really want to do is take the UI bits out of here and push them down into here, because really right now we have a logical separation. This stuff here is the UI layer, right? And this stuff up here is our service or our business layer. Right? Now I can put them into multiple files. I'm not doing to do that just for time considerations, but I absolutely could, where I start to now layer my application logically. I have files that represent the UI layer. I have files that represent the service layer, right, or business layer, or whatever it happens to be. Right? I can logically layer my application in JavaScript in the same way I logically layer my application in C# or VB. Okay? So what I want to do is get the UI stuff out of my service layer and get it down into my UI layer. Well, this becomes a little bit problematic because my service layer needs to know the names of the functions to call when that service call completes successfully or when it fails. Right? So what I have to do if I use this calling pattern is create those functions down here in my UI layer and then pass them off to my service layer. Well, that's too tight of a coupling. I don't want that. There's too much knowledge between the UI layer and the service layer. I want a much looser coupling. And we can achieve that using what are called jQuery deferred objects or promises, or the combination of the two. Okay? So basically what this says is the service layer is going to create an object which can pass off to my UI layer, and then my UI layer can decide what to do when the call completes successfully, or the operation completes successfully, or when it fails. Right? So I'm changing who's responsible for what happens during the completion of the service call from being in the service over to being in the UI. Right? And it's actually not that difficult to implement. So up here, what I'm going to do when I start to create username, or get username here, is I'm going to create a deferred object. So it's just jQuery.deferred. I always do that, not DQ, deferred. Okay? So then down here, and actually let's get this code out of our service layer, right? So let's just take this is all UI stuff. So let's just put this down here for now. Excuse me. Okay. So I still have a function that's going to get called when the call completes successfully, and a function that's going to get called when the call fails, right? So what happens when the call completes successfully? Well, I want to tell the deferred object that that's happened. So the way I do that is I do what's called resolving the deferred object. So I say here def.resolve. And then in here, I put whatever information I want to pass from the service layer out to the UI layer. Right? Well, the thing that we wanted to pass was the name of the user, right? This guy right here. So let's just take this and cut it to the clipboard and come up here and push it into here. All right, now down here, I want to tell the deferred object it's failed. It's been rejected, right? So it's def.reject. And again, I want to pass some information off to the UI layer, and that information is the error message that was given to me. So I'll put that into here. And then the very last thing I need to do is return an object to the UI layer so we can get access to this information that's being passed. And that's called the promise. So I'm going to say here, return def.promise, .progress promise. Okay. So I created a deferred object. I'm using the resolve method to say when it's complete successfully, tell the UI layer about the username, and when it fails, tell the UI layer about the error message, and it's going to do that through this promise object that's returned from this call. Okay. So now down here in my UI, when I call get username, I'm going to get a variable back which represents that service call. So I'll call it call, right? And this has two properties I can use to signal what to do when the call completes successfully. So that's call.done. And in here, the script takes a function. And this function is going to be passed what was passed during the resolve, right? So that was the username. So this is going to get passed the username. Name, like that. So what I can do now is take this call that's going to update the paragraph tag, right? The dollar message is the ID of the paragraph tag here, so it's going to update this guy. Right, so coming back over here, I'm going to say hello plus username, right? What was passed to me from the resolve. And then if this call fails, so call.fail, I'm also going to have a function. It's going to get past the error message. Excuse me. And then what I want to do, I want to alert out that error message. Okay, so it's error message. All right, so we hit F5. Should see exactly the same result in the browser we had before, right? But now I've started to logically layer my application in a way that maps to the layering that we're used to over, in a .NET code environment, right? So I found during my software development, actually just during life in general, that I can learn new things much more quickly if I can try to relate that new thing to something that I already know, right? So if you can write your client-side code in a way that's similar enough to your server-side code that you can start to apply the same practices you've been used to applying for a long time, you're going to learn how to write client-side code much more quickly, right? And you're going to write better enterprise-style JavaScript code than just writing script into the page. Okay, I got a few more minutes. So I'm going to get away from the writing code to just show you some already predefined code. Again, all of the slides and demos are available for you to download. Okay, so what's going on with my taskbar here? There we go. Okay, so let's open up another instance of Visual Studio. And let's just grab that path and then say here, File, Open, Project. And we want to go over here, and we want to use the app demo. Actually, while I'm here, since we just kind of discussed it, let's go back over here. Just a few minutes. Open project. This is sort of relates to the question the gentleman had a little bit earlier about working with lists and that kind of stuff. If you're going to be injecting JavaScript code into like pages and that kind of stuff. So for example, here I've got this hello text file that has some JavaScript code inside of here, right? So this is something I can put into, in this case, what I'm putting it into, putting hello.txt into this my scripts folder. right? Then I can use the content editor web part to use that already loaded script from the feature. So at least I'm deploying my stuff in a repeatable way, right? Also, and this particularly applies to sandbox solutions. I can use this custom action element to load a JavaScript library. So what this does is say this element is associated with this feature. When this feature gets activated, I want to have all the pages within the current site collection reference that version of jQuery, right? So as soon as I activate the feature, any page request for pages within that same site collection will have jQuery referenced automatically. So in the script I'm going to use inside of the content editor web part, or the script editor web part, I don't have to reference jQuery, because I know that as soon as I activate the feature, it's automatically referenced, right? So this is something that, again, if you're going to start using the script editor or the content editor web part, this is a repeatable way to deploy and reference your scripts so that you don't have to worry about doing that inside of the web parts themselves. Okay, so this is also available in your download code. All right, let's get back to what we're talking about here just a second ago. So let me just see if I got the right one. Yeah, I do. Okay, I talked about promises, and I talked about having the common calling pattern, right? So my UI is always going to use done and fail and complete in the promise calling pattern, right? But you get some additional benefits as well. If all of the things you're calling return promises, then you can do call chaining or control the order in which calls are made, right? So jQuery has this method called when I can use. And what I can do is I can do two calls or multiple calls that all return a promise inside of the when. And then what will happen is the page will wait until both of these calls are completed before it goes into done. Right? So if I need to know, in this case, the current username and the data from the products list before I render my page, I can do this using when. I can also use chaining through when and then. So I can say when this first call completes, then execute this other call. And the data that's coming from the first call will get passed to the second call. Right? So through the use of when and then, with jQuery promises, I can start to do call chaining and take code that would be very, not difficult, but it would be a lot of code to write manually, right? With, do the first call, and then the done of the first call, then call the second call, and so on. And, you get this very deep nesting. I can do that very elegantly using when and then. Now, I know that in the short time that I've had to talk about this, it's a little bit difficult to maybe comprehend the value of this. It took me a long time myself. But just understand that if you always return promises, that you have this called, synchronization or chaining available to you through jQuery, right? And do some more explanation on your own, because again, I won't be able to explain it completely within the next, 5 minutes, or actually the 0 minutes that I have left. All right, so I know we got the prize giveaway, so I'm just going to go to the last slide here. So again, I've already tweeted out the link to this material. If you want me to send you that link by email, just send me an email with my email address there, or come up and get a business card. I'm happy to hang around and answer any questions. Thank you so much, and good luck in the project.